Plan for America podcast is a show dedicated to national unity through prosperity that's achieved by free market capitalism. We believe that a rising tide does lift all boats. This show will be positive, solution-oriented, and nonpartisan. Our only agenda is for the prosperity of our country and her people. All are welcome here. This show will not be argumentative or incendiary, sensational, or polarizing and divisive. What we are presenting is a positive solution to one of America's greatest problems. Hello and welcome to Plan for America podcast, coming to you from Dynamic Reality Technologies on the campus of Coastal Alabama Community College in Fairhope, Alabama. I'm your host, Eric Nager, and our special guest today is John Steele Gordon. He's an editor, he's a writer, he's a thought leader. Thank you for being on the show today, John.
Happy to be here.
John, if you could please introduce yourself to our audience, tell us your educational background and some of your career highlights, please.
Well, I went to Vanderbilt University and got a BA in history a long time ago, it seems now. I worked at what was then Harper & Row, now HarperCollins, a major New York publishing house. And then in 1972, I left there to drive a Land Rover from New York to Tierra del Fuego and back as far as Rio.
Wow.
And it took 9 months, and I think there was something like 43 flat tires on the way. But it was a great trip, and I loved it. My whole family, I'm afraid, is besotted with wanderlust. And I've been many places in the world. I haven't been to, there's still some, I've never been to Southeast Asia or Australia or Scandinavia. But I hope to get to them before the end. When I came back, I worked for Congressman Herman Badillo, and who ran for mayor of New York in 1977. And I got to see an awful lot of New York City that I hadn't known before even existed, which was great education. And then I was, as his press secretary in New York, I didn't have a great deal to do, and my office was only 2 blocks from the New York Public Library. So I started going over there and researching stories I wanted to write. And one of them I wanted to write was on the gold panic of 1869, which was probably the most exciting single day in the history of Wall Street. And I went to the card catalog. In those days, it actually still was a card catalog.
Right.
And to see when was the last time a book had been written on the Erie Wars, which was the fight for control of the Erie Railway between Commodore Vanderbilt and Jay Gould, of which the gold panic was a part. And I was astonished to discover that the last time anybody had written a book on the Erie Wars was 1871, when they were still going on, by Charles Francis and Henry Adams. So I decided I was going to write that book. And fortunately, my grandfather was a Wall Street broker, or had been. And so I knew all the Wall Street lingo. I knew what selling short was before I could ride a bicycle. And so I wrote the book, which is called The Scarlet Woman of Wall Street, which was the name Charles Francis Adams gave to the Erie Railway, because it broke the hearts of so many investors. And that book was published, and then American Heritage asked me to be its business columnist, and I've written several other books since. I've written columns for New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Barron's, you name it.
Yeah. And you continue to do so, and I think that's how I discovered you, was through an article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh.
Well, so speaking of other books that you've written, I wanted to ask you about 3 in particular that might be of interest to our viewers and our listeners. One of them, speaking of Wall Street, you wrote The Great Game, The Emergence of Wall Street as a World Power. So tell us a little bit about that book, please.
Well, The Great Game was a history of Wall Street. from its founding in 1654 when they built the wall. New York City is the only major American city ever to have been walled. It didn't work. The British came up by sea and put the Dutch colony under its guns, and they surrendered without a shot. And up until it was published in the year 2000, and then subsequently it was published in several other countries, including China, where it has been a huge bestseller, I'm very happy to say. It's now in its third Chinese edition. And it did much better in China than it did here. It did very well here. CNBC did a 2-hour special on it.
Well, congratulations, but it's just more about the history than about how it came to be and all that.
Exactly, it's history. It's not how to make $1 million in Wall Street.
Okay, well, let's also then talk about, speaking of history, An Empire of Wealth, the Epic History of American Economic Power. What was the inspiration for that book?
Well, an editor asked me to write it and offered me a contract that I was more than willing to accept. And what it is the history of the American economy, starting with, Jamestown up to the present, but it doesn't have a single chart or graph in it. I mean, it's narrative history, but it focuses on the economy of this country over the 400 years that we've been in existence, instead of the politics or the, wars and what have you.
Mm-hmm. And given that you've looked at the long sweep of history, how much of an aberration is the current era we're in now, where debts and deficits play such an outsized role in our government?
It is a brand new era. Up until the 1930s, it was accepted by everybody, Democrats, Republicans alike, that after national defense, the first duty of the government was to pay down the debt, if not get rid of it. In fact, in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson paid off the entire American national debt, the only time a major nation has ever done that in history. But beginning in the 1930s, another priority came in, which was not to have another Great Depression.
Right.
And also, Lord Keynes published his magnificent book on economics and revolutionized the thought in this country and around the world. And he argued that when the economy was not doing well, when it was not up to capacity, that the government should deliberately spend in deficit in order to stimulate the economy.
Right.
And politicians thought that was a great idea, because politicians love to spend money so that people will vote for them. Of course, Keynes also said that when the economy is doing well, when we're in a boom, that the government should deliberately spend in surplus in order to pay back that debt we borrowed during bad economic times, so that we could borrow it again. And you can't borrow $1 twice without paying it back first.
That part is forgotten of what he said.
Completely forgotten. It was very inconvenient politically, so it's just got down the memory tool.
I think he also said, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. I think he said that as well.
I believe he did say that.
Okay. Well, that does bear directly on Plan for America. So I think one thing, you also wrote a piece for Hillsdale College about inflation recently. And of course, the Great Depression in the 30s was a deflation, which is something that I think our central bank is more afraid of, because they don't know how to deal with it. With inflation, you raise interest rates. What do you do to combat a deflation?
Well, that's the big problem. It's very hard to deal with deflation, as the Japanese will happily tell you, from the 90s on.
Right.
Because you can always stop inflation by simply raising interest rates. And that's exactly what Paul Volcker did beginning in 1979. And
yes,
he ended
he did.
Inflation of the 1970s, the highest peacetime inflation in American history. But, when there's a strong inflation going on, people spend their money as fast as they can. In the great inflation of the 1923 in Germany, people would open up their pay packets and literally run to the stores to get rid of the money before it lost even more value.
Right.
With deflation, what you tend to do is, well, let's not buy the car this year. Let's wait till next year when it will be cheaper.
Right. Purchasing is postponed.
Yeah, so it's very hard to deal with deflation. That's why the Fed has always set or in recent decades, has set a 2% target for inflation, to keep inflation at 2%, so they wouldn't slip into deflation. But also, of course, we weren't supposed to go beyond 2%, and now we're what, about 7.9 or something.
Yes, we've overshot it a little bit as of today. One other book I want to ask you about before we get to the break: Hamilton's Blessing: The Extraordinary Life and Times of Our National Debt. So the reference there is to our first Secretary of the Treasury, who became quite popular with the musical. But tell us a little bit about that book, please.
Well, Hamilton's Blessing, the title comes from Hamilton saying in the Federalist Papers that a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. And it has certainly been exactly that. I mean, in the 1860s, we used the national debt to save the Union. In the 1930s, we used it to save the economy. In the 1940s, we used it to save the world. But now it has gotten completely out of hand. I mean, the budget process has completely broken down. One thing, what happened was that Richard Nixon, presidents had always had what was called the power of impoundment. I mean, only Congress can authorize the spending of money, but there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the president to actually spend it. And the first president not to was Thomas Jefferson. And virtually every president since, including Lyndon Johnson, impounded funds in order to keep the budget under control. And this also, of course, gave him negotiating power with Congress. I mean, he could say, okay, I'll be with you on that bridge to nowhere, provided that you're with me on reforming Social Security or whatever. In 1974, Nixon overdid it. He impounded an entire appropriation for the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah.
Congress thought it was usurping their power of the purse. And so they passed the Budget Control Act, it was called, which is most misnamed law in American history, I think, because the budget instantly went out of control, took the power of impoundment away from the president. And so suddenly, the only person in Washington who's elected by the entire nation had no power over the budget. He had no negotiating power whatsoever. And everybody in Congress, while they're all in favor of prudent financial policies, they're also in favor of bringing home the bacon to their state or their congressional district. And how do you get things done in Congress? You log roll. You say, you vote for my thing and I'll vote for yours.
Right. Has the constitutionality of that law ever been tested? It
has been tested, and the Supreme Court has upheld it.
Okay.
We did pass in the 1990s, we passed a line item veto, which almost all state governors have.
Right.
And this again would give the president negotiating power. The Supreme Court ruled against it 6-3. So it's interesting that it was, there were 3 people on the court in the 1990s who thought it was constitutional. And I think the court is much more conservative court today than it was back in 96.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe it could be tested again.
I think it could be tested again, and I certainly hope that it is. Or we should get a constitutional amendment through to allow it.
Okay.
Because the Budget Control Act, 1974, in the 6 years before the Budget Control Act, with the Vietnam War raging, average deficits were $11 billion a year. In the 6 years after the Budget Control Act, the Vietnam War being over with, the average budget deficit was $53 billion. In other words, 5 times as big after the Budget Control Act.
Yeah, that's not a coincidence, I don't think.
That's not a coincidence.
Wow, that's all very provocative stuff, John. We're going to take a quick break here and be right back with Plan for America podcast after this.
If you like what you're hearing and want to learn more about Plan for America, visit our website at www.planforamerica.us. There's an extensive Q&A section there, and if you don't see a question you have, then please ask us by email. You can order our book, Plan for America: How to Place the American Dream on a Sure Foundation Forever. That can be found on Amazon.com. You can like us on Facebook. And if you really like what you're hearing, you're welcome to contribute through our website. Plan for America is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and all contributions are tax deductible.
And welcome back to Plan for America podcast. I'm your host, Eric Nager. We're interviewing John Steele Gordon today. He's a writer, he's an editor, he's a thought leader, a book author. We've been talking about some of his titles. John, if someone wanted to learn about what else you've written about or get in touch with you, what is the best contact, like our website or anything like that, for people to find out more information about you?
They can just use my email, which is jsg@johnsteelegordon.com.
jsg@johnsteelegordon.com. There you go. Well, before the break, we were talking about Hamilton's Blessing, one of your books, The Extraordinary Life and Times of Our National Debt. And that is one thing that Plan for America is designed specifically to retire, and to do it in a unique way that we haven't seen proposed before. Most of the proposals out there today tweak the current system, try to do means testing or try to do, raise retirement age or something like that, that doesn't fundamentally solve the problem, but kind of kicks the can further down the road, to use that analogy. Our plan has a funding mechanism whereby the debt would be retired over time and would use the markets, harnessing Wall Street, to act as a first line of defense in building people's wealth, and also the ability, therefore, to pay down the debt and deficit. What's your thought about privatization in that regard, John, to help in this crisis that we have today?
Well, we certainly need to do something, and the sooner we do it, the better, because at some point, even a country as rich and dynamic as the United States is going to max out its credit card. And
yes.
The problem is we don't know what that point is. It's just the markets, one day, and markets can change on a dime. Just like in the 1970s, New York City issued a whole new set of bonds and, took them down to Wall Street to be underwritten, and Wall Street says nope. And so New York City went broke. And that's going to happen to the United States. Suddenly the market's going to say, we don't like your credit rating anymore, and we're not going to lend you money at the current interest rates.
All right. So in other words, yes. So what would national bankruptcy look like if the markets no longer took U.S. government debt, for example?
Well, it would be a disaster of unimaginable proportions, because as Hamilton pointed out, the debt is a blessing. We can use it in emergencies. Instead, we've been using it in order to get people in Washington reelected, and for nothing else. I mean, since 1970, when the national debt was under $1 trillion, we have had no great war. We've had no great depression. We've had great boom times, and yet the national debt has gone up by a factor of 30.
That's right, $30 trillion.
$30 trillion, and it was under $1 trillion in 1970.
Well, that's not to mention the unfunded liabilities, which is somewhere between, we believe, $100 and $200 trillion more. When you talk about the obligations for Social Security and Medicare, you add that on there, then that really makes it an onerous burden.
Well, that's, there's a difference between the debt that we owe with the full faith and credit of the United States. We owe the Social Security and Medicare by law, and Congress can change that law anytime it wants to and say, sorry, you're going to have to wait till you're 75 to go on Social Security, or you're going to have to do this, that, and the other thing. I mean, so that we could deal with that part by legislation, but the full faith and credit is in the Constitution, and the only way to abrogate the debt would be to change the Constitution or ignore it. Or, of course, there's always one way to get out of an unpayable debt, and that's to inflate it into insignificance.
Yes, inflate it or repudiate it or borrow more, roll it over. But our solution is to actually pay it down. So our plan, if enacted, it would be through contract law, not just legislation, so that it would be more difficult to change. The contract would be among the federal government, the state governments collectively, and this private trust to be established by the contract. Once it was established, each citizen could opt into the system. It would not be mandatory, but his or her 15.3% of the payroll taxes would be, instead of going to the government, would go to the trust in an account in his or her name and would be invested in an all US domiciled market index, a total market index, which has historically returned, as you know, as a student of Wall Street, on average about 10% a year. Our model assumes 6.2% to be in conformity with Congressional Budget Office assumptions. And then it would be virtually costless to administer an index fund like that. We could bid it out to BlackRock or Vanguard or something. They might charge a basis point to do that. So it'd be virtually costless. The trust would then take 2% of the assets in the trust. So for example, in year one, if everyone opted in, there'd be about $1 trillion going into the trust. That's the current payroll taxes today. 2% of that's 20 billion. And the following year would be another 20 billion, et cetera. That money would initially be used to pay off the current retirees, so all the promises to them would be kept. And the trust could float bonds in the meantime to be to have a means of paying off the current retirees. And the bonds by contract would be guaranteed by the US government and the interest would be paid by the US government. When all those bonds were retired, and depending on the market assumptions you make, somewhere between 2054 and 2071, all debts and deficits would be retired. That's the big picture overview. And I wanted to get your take on that as a historian and an economist.
Well, I'm certainly in favor of turning Social Security into something like that, with private accounts in which you have a property interest in. You have none in the Social Security system. And the Social Security system currently is invested only in special federal bonds, which pay a common interest rate. They average what interest rates are at that time when they issue them. And they can only be redeemed from the Treasury. You can't sell them on the open bond market.
That's right, they're non-negotiable.
Right. And so what Congress has done, actually, with Lyndon Johnson, who ordered a change to put Social Security on budget in order to make his deficits look smaller. I mean, so what we're doing right now is we're borrowing money from the Social Security Trust Fund,
yes,
putting it into the Treasury and calling it income. Now, any corporation who tried to stunt like that, their management would be making license plates in Club Fed. I mean, it is obvious accounting fraud. What they should have done, I suppose, was they should have had you can't have the Social Security Administration buying, playing a character in the stock market, because they'd be the 800-pound gorilla in the market. So they should have been restricted to buying federal bonds, but they should have owned those bonds and the Treasury should have had nothing to do with them. But anyway, that's water over the dam. So I think, Chile has done this. A lot of other countries have done this, have privatized pension funds, the federal national pension funds. And I think that's an excellent idea. The big problem here is, how do you stop Congress from spending too much money? Okay, so the trust fund is paying down the debt and Congress is happily running up the debt. I mean, how do you control Congress? I think the only way to do that is to give the president the power to set overall spending. That you can't, we're going to spend no more than X trillion dollars this year. And it'll be up to Congress to decide how to divvy that up among the defense and what have you. And they could override the president on a 2/3 vote if they
Right.
like the veto. And then also give them a strong line item veto. A very strong one, like the governor of Wisconsin has. The governor of Wisconsin can strike anything out of a law. You can't put anything in. You can't even add a comma, but he can take out a word. And so, he can take out the whole line item, or he can actually just delete a single word, and suddenly there's basically no money to be spent there.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
that. And
Well, yeah, and in our case, what we'd be looking at if you take, because now, Social Security and Medicare are starting to pay out more than they're taking in even. So it's a drain on the budget now as the demographics of this country shift. So what we were looking at, what our models indicated prior to COVID-19, now this is the caveat, but if Social Security and Medicare were taken off the books of the government, then they could essentially balance the budget. This is before COVID-19. So by taking those levers away from government, healthcare and retirement, the government then could focus on spending on things like defense and other necessary items. And down the road, one of the other provisions of the contract is that once all debts and deficits are retired, the money generated by the trust could eventually replace taxation of any sort as the funding mechanism for government. So that's long-term, that's down the road. And again, our plan also covers comprehensive health care for every U.S. citizen as well. I wasn't going to touch upon that as much in this interview, just really more on the Wall Street and the investing side, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, we essentially have a form of medical coverage for everybody. It's a great messy, could hardly call it a system. Medicare is, after all, is a system, but Medicare, of course, is an extremely badly run insurance company.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, but governments are just terrible at running anything. And the reason
Seems to be the case.
Right.
That's our plan.
It is competition that puts noses to grindstones. Nobody works any harder than they have to in order to get what their ambitions are. Lions don't chase the fast zebras to get their supper. They chase the slow ones. They taste just as good.
Right.
But there's competition that forces you to work hard and to innovate. Otherwise, your competition will eat your lunch. Government never has competition. And therefore, bureaucrats don't work hard. They love to make rules because that gives bureaucrats more to do, and therefore they get a bigger budget and they get more people report to them, which is how bureaucrats measure their success, is how many people do they report to them. So I want government to do as little as possible. I think I would take the Veterans Administration medical system, also a very badly run medical insurance company, and privatize it. Just sell off the hospitals and everything and give all the veterans an insurance policy put out by United Healthcare or whomever. And I think then we should move towards that in Medicare as well. And just because, as I say, some things government has to run. We can't have the Navy being run by, different billionaires. But if the government doesn't absolutely have to run it, it shouldn't run it, because governments are terrible at running anything.
Well, that's the reason for our private trust to try to take these big important features off the government so that they can be more efficient and last into the future, which we need. John, as we wind up here, any other questions or comments on Plan for America and our proposal?
No, it sounds very intriguing, and I think it should get large discussion because we have to do something. One other thing we do have to do is we have to get Congress to actually pass budgets.
Yes.
It's been years, decades since Congress has actually passed a budget, and we've had budget or government shutdowns and all kinds of political theater. And I think one way to get Congress to do its job would be to set absolute deadlines. They have to have, do this by April 1st, this by May 1st, whatever, so that they're completely done by October 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year. And if they don't keep to that deadline, neither Congress nor their staff gets paid. And I promise you, the staff will be putting enormous pressure on the congressmen and the senators to do their damn job.
Well, that idea makes a lot of sense. I hope they're listening to you. I really appreciate you being our guest today, John. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Join us next time for another edition of Plan for America podcast.
If you like what you're hearing and want to learn more about Plan for America, visit our website at www.planforamerica.us. There's an extensive Q&A section there, and if you don't see a question you have, then please ask us by email. You can order our book, Plan for America: How to Place the American Dream on a Sure Foundation Forever. That can be found on Amazon.com. You can like us on Facebook, and if you really like what you're hearing, you're welcome to contribute through our website. Plan for America is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and all contributions are tax deductible.